Every city has a skeleton. Beneath the glass towers of the modern world, under the paved parking lots and the sprawling suburbs, lies the rusted iron frame of an era we have almost forgotten. In Oshawa, Ontario, the city known globally for the roar of General Motors, that skeleton is made of a very specific material, malleable iron. If you drive down Front Street today, you'll see it, a massive, weather-beaten red brick fortress. It looks like a prison or perhaps a castle that lost a war. For decades, it was a Nob Hill Farms grocery terminal, but for nearly a century before that, it was the Ontario Malleable Iron Company, or OMIC. At its peak, this wasn't just a factory, it was the Manchester of Canada. It was the largest molding shop in the British Empire. Inside these walls, temperatures reached 2,000 degrees. Men worked in a literal hellscape of liquid fire to create the parts that allowed Canada to grow from a colony into a superpower. They made the plows that broke the prairie sod. They made the couplings for the transcontinental railroad. They made the wheels for the tanks that liberated Europe. And yet, in 1977, after 105 years of defiance, the fires went out forever. Why did a company that was essential to the survival of the nation simply stop existing? Was it a failure of technology? A failure of leadership? Or was it a casualty of a year-long war between the men on the floor and the men in the boardroom? This is the story of a company that forged a city, survived 2 world wars and a Great Depression, only to be dismantled by the very progress it helped create. This is the rise and fall of the Ontario Malleable Iron Company. To understand the brand, we have to understand why malleable was the tech buzzword of the 1870s. In the mid-19th century, if you were a farmer in Ontario and your plow hit a rock in the frozen ground, your cast iron blade would shatter. Cast iron was strong, but it was brittle. It couldn't handle the shock. Malleable iron was the solution. Through a complex process of annealing, heating the iron for days on end and slowly cooling it, the metal changed its molecular structure. It became malleable. It could be hammered, bent, and twisted without breaking. The Ontario Malleable Iron Company brand became synonymous with unbreakable. When a farmer saw the OMIC stamp on his machinery, he knew he was buying reliability. But the brand was about more than just metal. It was about the identity of a town. Oshawa in 1872 was a small village of a few thousand people. The arrival of the malleable changed everything. It created a foundry culture. To work at the malleable was to be part of an industrial elite. It required a level of physical stamina that is almost unimaginable today. These were men who moved tons of molten iron by hand in ladles, walking across sand floors in heat that would melt modern sneakers. The brand was the Iron Heart. It stood for the grit of the Irish immigrants who founded it and the craftsmanship of the molders who sustained it. For 100 years, if Canada needed to hold something together, a bridge, a train, or a car, it looked to the red bricks of Oshawa. Every empire has a patriarch. For OMIC, it was John Cowan. But Cowan wasn't an iron master by trade. He was a survivor. Born in County Tyrone, Ireland in 1806, John and his brother William were part of the great wave of Irish migration to Canada. They didn't come with money, they came with an appetite for opportunity. They started in dry goods business, selling fabric and groceries, first in Toronto, then in Port Perry. By the time John Cowan reached Oshawa, he was already a seasoned businessman. He saw a town that was perfectly positioned. It had a harbor on Lake Ontario and a railway line running through its heart. Most importantly, it had a local government that was desperate for industry. In 1872, John Cowan did something bold. He didn't just build a shop, he leveraged the town. He convinced the township of Oshawa to give him a bonus, a massive tax break, and a cash incentive of $5,000 to start a malleable iron foundry.
In exchange, he promised to employ at least 50 men. Along with his brother William and a few partners, John incorporated the Ontario Malleable Iron Company on a 10-acre plot along Front Street. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. He lacked the know-how of the molding process.
In a brilliant move of early industrial poaching, Cohen went to the United States. He traveled to Troy, New York, then the center of the American iron industry, and hired expert molders and foremen. He didn't just buy machines, he bought brains. He brought these experts to Oshawa to train a local workforce that had previously only known how to mill flour or saw wood. John Cohen was the visionary. William was the operator. Together, they established a paternalistic style of management. They were the kings of Oshawa. They founded the Ontario Loan and Savings Company to help their workers buy houses. They sat on the boards of hospitals and schools. To the Cohens, the factory wasn't just a business, it was a legacy. They built the foundry to last forever. They used the highest quality bricks and the most advanced ventilation systems of the time. They were building an ironclad future for their family and their city. Little did they know, the very city they were building would eventually outgrow them. By the 1880s, the Ontario Malleable Iron Company was no longer a risky startup, it was the engine of Oshawa. But being the engine meant carrying the weight of a growing nation. Canada was expanding west, and the iron of the Cohen brothers was on every train car headed for the prairies. The company's growth was aggressive. Every few years, a new wing was added to the Front Street plant. They were no longer just making simple plow parts. They were manufacturing complex pipe fittings, radiator parts, and intricate ornamental ironwork that decorated the grand Victorian homes of Toronto and Montreal. The Malleable was a pioneer in industrial efficiency. They were one of the first factories in the region to move away from pure water power to massive steam engines. They created their own internal rail system, a network of tracks within the factory walls, so that raw pig iron could be moved from the smelting furnace to the molding floor with minimal effort. But on a cold night in December 1894, the Iron Empire almost came to a screeching halt. Fire is the constant shadow of any foundry. In an era of wooden rafters and open flame furnaces, it was a matter of when, not if. The 1894 fire was catastrophic. It started in the core room, and, fueled by the oils used in the molding process, it raced through the timber-framed buildings. By morning, the largest molding shop in the Dominion was a smoking pile of twisted metal and charred brick. The loss was calculated at $120,000, an astronomical sum in the 1890s. Even worse, the company was only insured for about 20% of that value. The local newspapers predicted the end of OMIC. They assumed the Cohens would take their remaining wealth and retire. They were wrong. John Cohen saw the fire not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to modernize. He didn't just rebuild, he reinvented. The 1897 reconstruction was a masterpiece of industrial design. They built with high-quality red brick and steel. They expanded the floor space to nearly 200,000 square feet. They installed state-of-the-art reverberatory furnaces that allowed for more precise control over the iron's chemical composition. When the doors reopened, the Ontario Malleable Iron Company was no longer just a local player. It was a global competitor. As the 20th century dawned, a new invention arrived that would change the destiny of the Malleable forever: the automobile. Just down the street, Robert McLaughlin was transitioning his carriage business into the motorcar industry. He needed parts that were light enough to be portable, but strong enough to handle the vibrations of an internal combustion engine. Malleable iron was the only answer. By 1910, OMIC was so central to the automotive supply chain that it actually employed more men than the McLaughlin Carriage Works. If you drove a car in Canada during the Edwardian era, there was a high probability that your steering housing, your brake pedals, and your engine mounts were poured in the Cohen foundry.
This was the peak of the paternalistic era. The company was the city. The Cohens donated land for parks, they funded the local library. The malleable man was a respected member of the community. He had a steady wage, a company-backed mortgage, and a sense of pride. Then came 1914, the Great War. Modern warfare is, at its heart, an industrial competition. The Ontario Malleable Iron Company became a vital cog in the British Empire's war machine. They pivoted away from farm tools and luxury cars to produce munitions, transport parts, and hardware for the trenches. The plant ran 24 hours a day. The glow from the furnaces lit up the Oshawa night sky so brightly it could be seen from miles away. This was the moment OMIC proved it could handle high-volume, high-precision work. In 1929, the Cohen era officially ended. The family sold their interests to the Grinnell Company of Canada, a subsidiary of a massive American multinational. The local family business was now part of a global conglomerate. But the momentum didn't stop. When World War II broke out, the Malleable reached its absolute production record. The Canadian military needed thousands of universal carriers, light armored tracked vehicles known as Bren gun carriers. The most difficult part to manufacture was the bogie wheel, the heavy-duty wheel that kept the tracks moving over mud and rubble.
OMIC took on the contract. At one point, 50% of the entire factory's output was dedicated to this one single part. Thousands of wheels poured out of the Oshawa foundry and into the battlefields of North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. In 1945, as the soldiers returned home, the Ontario Malleable Iron Company stood as a titan. It had survived the Depression, conquered 2 wars, and was ready to build the new suburban world of the 1950s. It seemed invincible. But the very thing that made it strong, its massive, specialized labor force, was about to become the catalyst for its destruction. In the post-war boom of the 1950s, the Ontario Malleable Iron Company appeared to be at its strongest. It was the backbone of the North American automotive industry. But beneath the surface, the world was changing in ways the foundry wasn't prepared for. The first crack was technology. For a century, malleable iron was the king of metals, but by the late 1950s, engineers were discovering nodular iron or ductile iron. This new material could be produced faster and with less energy than the traditional annealing process used at OMIC. Furthermore, the rise of aluminum and high-strength plastics began to chip away at the market. Cars needed to be lighter to save fuel. The heavy, indestructible iron parts that were the pride of the Cowan brothers were now being viewed as dead weight. But the biggest threat wasn't the material, it was the geography. The Front Street plant was now over 70 years old. It was a labyrinth of dark corridors, soot-stained bricks, and ancient machinery. While new high-tech foundries were opening in the southern United States and overseas, factories with robots and climate control, the Malleable remained a relic of the Victorian era. The end didn't come from a fire or a lack of orders. It came from a breakdown in the most basic human contract, the relationship between the worker and the owner. By the mid-1970s, the company was owned by ITT Grinnell, a massive American conglomerate. To the executives in a New York skyscraper, the Oshawa foundry was just a line on a balance sheet, and that line was turning red. In January 1976, the contract expired. The workers, represented by the United Auto Workers Local 222, demanded higher wages to keep up with skyrocketing inflation and better safety protections. The foundry was a dangerous place. Silicosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling sand dust, was a constant threat to the molders. The company refused to budge. They claimed that the plant was already losing money and that any wage increase would make it uncompetitive. The strike lasted for 14 brutal months. It was one of the longest and most bitter strikes in the history of the Canadian labor movement. Families in Oshawa were torn apart. Some workers crossed the picket lines to feed their children. Others stayed until they lost their homes.
On March 16, 1977, the workers finally gathered for a vote. They were exhausted. They expected a new offer from the company. Instead, they received a death warrant. ITT Grinnell announced they weren't negotiating anymore. They were closing the plant, effectively immediately. 105 years of history were wiped out with a single press release. So, did the Ontario Malleable Iron Company fail? The answer is a complex yes, but it wasn't a failure of quality. It was a failure of adaptation. There were three main reasons for the collapse. Industrial obsolescence. The plant was too old. To modernize it would have cost millions of dollars that the parent company, ITT Grinnell, wasn't willing to spend when they could build a newer, cheaper plant elsewhere. The labor deadlock. The strike became a game of chicken where both sides refused to blink. The union fought for a future that the company's outdated business model could no longer afford. And the multinational factor. Unlike the Cowan brothers who lived in Oshawa and were invested in its survival, ITT Grinnell had no emotional tie to the city. When the numbers didn't work, they walked away. Today, the Malleable is a ghost that refused to leave. After the iron went cold, it spent 20 years as a grocery terminal. Today, it sits on the edge of a new transformation. Metrolinx is turning the site into the new Oshawa GO station, a hub for the very commuters who now work in the digital world. The red bricks will remain. They are protected by heritage laws, a final nod to the Cowan brothers' vision of building something ironclad. Once upon a company, there was iron, and because of that iron, there is a city.